The previous video that you saw was largely about differences between qualitative and quantitative research, the introduction to design for quantitative study and how to plan for it, the tools and tools for sampling. For today's agenda, we are moving on to basic research types again, because there is again a question of the types of research. And so Sharon will briefly touch on that. You've asked again about the research design. You have asked questions about survey, some about data collection, and rightfully so about the design, validity, and how to be sure that what you're doing is the valid way and credible way of justifying your research and ensuring that your research is comes up to the standards of what a research should be. Sharon, welcome for joining the session, and welcome and an immense thanks for being the expert. And I think you are the only one in Pakistan who has a degree in PhD in biostatistics, and we are honored to have you at FCC. So who could be better than to talk about quantitative research and data? You are also the chairperson of the Department of Statistics, and surprisingly, you have a long teaching history. I think you have taught here for how many years, Sharon? You have 11 years at GCU at
6 years at FC College.
Oh, wow. You are a member of American Statistical Association for some time. You have been a Fulbright Fellow. You have been the chair of the student organizations in your own university, Case Western University in USA. You have worked in different committees. And we are, like I said, we are very, very happy to have you. You enjoy our programming, and I have no clue what is our programming. It is the ignoramus. So do tell very briefly about that, and then we'll move on with your session. What is our programming?
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Ruxana, for a wonderful introduction. Yeah, our programming is actually a programming language that is very widely used among artificial intelligence and data analytics, data science, and not only there, but in biomedical sciences as well, in bioinformatics and all other fields. So that's what it is. And we have, yeah, so there is Python and there is R. So Python is more is developed by computer scientists, and R is developed by statisticians for the same task.
Okay, excellent. You know, that's information that we should know, because now is the world of computer. So over to you, Sharon. You know the agenda, you sort of polished it up for us. So over to you.
Yeah, sure. So as Dr. Ruxana has already mentioned, that I will be talking about quantitative research, and more specifically in the quantitative research, it will be study design, questionnaire, and sample size estimation. This is going to be certainly a long session, but I understand that we do have time restrictions. So I will be skipping few things, because you must have gone through my earlier recordings that have been shared by Mr. Suleiman to all of you. I haven't brought major changes into these slides since then, but obviously there will be a discussion that will, allow us to deviate from what really is in the slides, and that is related to your specific interests. So, as Dr. Ruxana and Suleiman has mentioned, that please feel free to ask questions. I encourage asking questions and discussions, because that's the time when I will be learning from you people as well. So Dr. Ruxana has a couple of times said expert. Yeah, I am no expert into it. I'm just one of the students like you. So whenever we talk about the research, then obviously there are two major types. One is qualitative research, and other is quantitative research. And we had earlier sessions about the qualitative research that was conducted by, I think, Dr. Sarah. And today we're going to talk about the quantitative research, where, quantitative research, when we talk about it, it's defined as some of the phenomena that's where we explain it by collecting numerical data that are analyzed using statistical methods. Moreover, when we talk about the quantitative research or the quantitative methods, they emphasize on objective measurements, unlike qualitative research that is more based upon subjective approach. Moreover, in quantitative methods, we emphasize on statistical, mathematical, or numerical analyses of the data. But the more important thing is the data in here, that what kind of data we are dealing with. And when we talk about data, we are dealing with the numerical data that could be obtained by primary source that we call primary data, and it could be a secondary data. So whenever we talk about the primary data, we talk about the surveys, polls, questionnaires. This is the first-hand information, whereas the secondary data is the second-hand information. It's about the data that has already been collected, like we have PDHS, Pakistan Demographic and Health Survey, that is all conducted by some other organization. But if you want to use that analysis, that data, you can always access the data and use it for your own purpose. So that is called a secondary data. And moreover, these quantitative research focuses on gathering numerical data and generalizing it across the groups of people or to explain a particular phenomena. So generalization is one of the very important aspect of the quantitative research, that when we rely on a small body of data that we call sample, and we extrapolate the information coming from the sample to the population, and that's what generalization is. And this is one of the very important aspect of the quantitative research. So here are a few characteristics of the quantitative research, that whenever we talk about it, we talk about the data, and this is the data that is usually gathered using structured research instrument. And those structured research instruments could be your polls, could be your questionnaires. So the results in the quantitative research are based on larger sample sizes that are representative of the population, and that's one of the very important part. Whenever we talk about the sample, we talk about sample as the representative part of the population. Here, in quantitative research, we always have to have a focus that what will be our population and what would be our sample and how much sample size is appropriate. And that's what I will be talking about it later in this talk. Moreover, quantitative research talks about the research studies that can easily be replicated or repeated given its high reliability. And that's one of the very important aspect of quantitative research that actually make it more reliable. And one of the big challenges that science is facing is replicability of the research, that the results being produced by one person in the same lab are not being replicated or repeated, which is most specifically in the biomedical sciences, this is one of the very biggest concern. But in quantitative research, it is so much structured that it relatively it gives us high reliability, and replicability can be achieved in the quantitative research. Moreover, a researcher has a clearly defined research question to which objective answers are sought. And this is one of the very important aspects. When we talk about the quantitative research, you from the beginning till the end, you are all very focused. You're very focused towards your research question. You have to have a very clear research question that leads to very clear research objectives and their answers. So, in short, all aspects of the study are carefully designed before data is collected. And this is something that differentiates qualitative research from the quantitative research. Qualitative research give us liberty, that you can start with a very small thing and a smaller idea and build upon it and go wider on it. Whereas when we talk about the quantitative research, from the very first step, it is so focused, it is so structured that you spend a whole lot of time in the planning of it. I mean, I usually say that sometimes half of the time is spent in any quantitative research project on its planning, and half of the time is actually performing the research or actually collecting the information about it and analyzing it. So in quantitative research, it is very important that you start very carefully. You plan things before you actually collect your data. And that's where I really want to quote Sir Ronald Almer Fisher, who is one of the very well-known statistician. He's known as the father of modern statistics. That in quantitative research, when when you're doing quantitative research and you do not consult statistician, or you do not carefully design it before the data is collected, that's when you have a higher chance of making an error. And once the data has been collected and you are going to consult someone who is the expert in the analysis of the data, it's like asking them to carry out the autopsy of the data, because he can only tell you that how it has died off. But it's very important that you carefully design it, you carefully plan it before you really talk about the quantitative research and you jump onto the collection of the data. Further, in quantitative research, data are in the form of numbers and statistics, which are often arranged in the tables, charts, figures, and other non-textual forms. Moreover, quantitative research projects can be used to generalize concepts more widely, and they predict future results or investigate causal relationship, which is something that you can't really establish in the qualitative research. And this is something that's true about the qualitative research, that qualitative research can easily be challenged, whereas for the quantitative research, since it has been very carefully done and it has an empirical evidence next to it, then it's really hard to challenge, or you have to bring a very substantive argument quantitatively to really challenge it. And one important thing is that we often strive to obtain a causal relationship in our studies. So to prove or to establish a causal relationship, one has to rely on the quantitative research. And even in the quantitative research, there are more sophisticated study designs that help us to get to the establishment of a causal relationship. So in quantitative research, researchers, they use tools such as Questionnaire or computer software to collect numerical data. Recently, I know people have been using Google Forms, people have been using Survey Monkeys. They are designing specialized softwares to collect the information and using tablets to conduct the surveys, which is really, I think, is really good, because it helps reduce the human error to the max. But the more importantly, the overarching aim of the quantitative research study is to classify features, count them, and construct statistical models in an attempt to explain what is observed. So when we talk about the the steps in the quantitative research process, the very first step is the research problem. Then we jump on to the systematic literature review. But systematic literature review is something that should be placed anywhere in this process. And actually, when I talk about the systematic literature review at the second point, I am actually very careful by putting it here, because I firmly believe that whenever you carry out some quantitative research or any sort of research, you have to conduct a systematic literature review of the literature even prior to the research problem. So the way I think is that it should be systematic review of the literature and then research problem, systematic review of the literature and research question, systematic review of the literature and hypothesis, systematic review of the literature and operationalization or research design, systematic review of the literature and data collection. And it goes on every step, even policy making, and then it ends with the systematic review of the literature. You should not end this review of the literature at any time in your quantitative research. So this is one of my advice to everyone. Some people think that, oh, I have 50 papers, and they end up there and they say, oh, this is sufficient, and then they have done the literature review at the beginning of their study, and then they carry out the whole process, and at the end of the study they found out that, oh, well, there are some errors, or the same research has been published like few months back. So that's why I always encourage to put the systematic review of the literature at every phase, every step of your research. And that's how important it is. But today, I won't talk about the systematic review of literature as we already have this session, but I will be talking about the research question. That will be the first one. So whenever we develop a research question, you always want to keep in mind this finer criteria. Whenever you talk about a research question or you have some problem in your mind, you every research problem will give you some research question, and when you are talking about your research question to be something that you really want to work on, talk about the final criteria. And when you talk about the final criteria, the very first thing that you want to talk about is feasibility. So F stands for feasible in finer. So feasibility is should be in terms of it should adequate number of subjects should be recruited. You should ask your question, how much the sample size should be right here. Here you should talk about that, are there adequate number of subjects available to carry out this research? Will I be able to get sufficient number of people to respond to what to my questions? Then adequate technical expertise. That's extremely important. That we have to, and this is where I would refer to the undergraduate students and the graduate students here, that you have to be aware that you have those technical expertise available into the research areas that you're looking into. Sometimes, we are living in a in a country that has a very limited resource available, and especially technical resource available. So you really want to find out that, do we have a person who is technically sound to talk about this kind of research area that I'm taking in, or the methods I will be using for this research. So do talk about this thing at the time of at the time when you're pondering upon your research question. Then you look at the affordability in time and money. Some of the biomedical researches are very expensive. For to run a single sample, you get to spend thousands of dollars or thousands of rupees. So it also requires time. So you really don't want to pick up a project that you have only a year to finish your dissertation, and you are actually looking up to a project that may take you 3 years or 4 years. And I do have some examples where researchers were unable to finish their projects even in 6 years or 7 years, just because of the time issue. They ended up not really getting their degrees at the end. So this is right at the beginning of your study, where you are defining your research question. You really need to think ahead and talk about these matters very carefully. That, how much time do I have? How much money is required? Do I have all this money? And then it should be manageable in scope. Do not take up such a research question that is humongous. Please know this. As a researcher, you have to take small step. You are not going to get you're not going to get a Nobel Prize right at the beginning, with your first research project. The people who really have made a significant impact into the world, they have spent their whole life. And the way they have spent their whole life doing the same research is taking small steps at a time. So do not take up such research questions that are very huge, very humongous, that you can't really cover them up into the time, money, technical resources, and the adequate number of subjects availability. So you have to talk about these questions very carefully, and you have to be very honest with yourself while you respond to these questions. And this should be done at the beginning of your study. Then once you have talked about the feasibility part of it, the next step that you really want to talk about is the interestingness of your question. That, is your research question interesting? Is this something that intrigues you? It is something that you love to do. It is something that you really enjoy working with. So because if you're picking up the projects, some research questions which you really for which you really do not have any interest, you really don't want to be there, because you may not be able to finish the whole project, or the whole process. Then you also need to talk about the novelty of the research project that you are talking about, the research question that you're planning to study. That what it does, will it confirms the existing research, or it will refute the existing theory, or it extends the previous findings. So we really need to talk about it and respond to it. And you also need to provide new finding. Here, I would really like to talk about this matter that I actually have experienced that with some of my students, or some other research vivas, or while people are writing the reviews of the research, or that you haven't done anything new, this has already been done, so what new you are doing. So this is something that is not really the best response to any research. Like, many people, they come up with a research idea that has already been done somewhere, at some other place on the globe. It's fine. When we are talking about the quantitative research, we're talking about the data that you are getting from certain geographical bounds. And I mean, since I'm a biostatistician, and I know that I work with a lot of biomedical researchers, and we know that we are genetically different from other places. The choices, our culture impacts our choices, our decisions, our whole, the situation. So it is okay to do some research that confirms the existing theory. Yeah, some people really don't like it, but trust me, it is still a good thing. The reason I'm saying this is that in Pakistan, uh, we do have a lot of data available to us. We just don't report it, thinking, oh, the same research has already been done at some other place. Please know this: reporting our data is, I mean, a lot of organizations in Pakistan do have their data, but they're not doing proper reporting. They are just reporting the results in the form of percentages and all. That's it. But they don't really look at its causal impact, its correlational impacts of the data, or the results of the data, aspects of the data. So I would encourage people also to please do not be discouraged if you are replicating some research that has been done abroad or some other places, but not in Pakistan. And it is perfectly genuine research. But obviously, having a new idea that's something that provides new finding, is always the best one all over. So then you also need to respond towards the ethical aspect of the research. Every organization nowadays have institution research review boards. So you really need to make sure that you follow, if especially if you're doing human subject research, you should take the informed consent. And you also need to talk about the Helsinki guidelines, the research guidelines, so which are very important. And I would encourage all of the people who are listening to me today to actually check out Helsinki Declaration, which is extremely important. And many institution review boards in globally, they do follow Helsinki Declaration. Even at FC College, we do follow Helsinki Declaration. So to talk about the ethics in the research. Moreover, you want to make sure that your research question is relevant to scientific knowledge, and to the future research, which is something always important. And that's also give us a good criteria to develop a good research question. Once we have the research question, then we want to talk about the research design. This is an aspect where I have seen a lot of research, lacking a good research study design. Having a good research and clear research study design helps improve the quality of overall research. So when we talk about the research study design, before we talk about it, I always encourage people to talk about the PICOT criteria. Some people call it PICO criteria as well. So in PICOT, we firstly talk about the population. When we talk about the population, it refers to the sample of subjects you wish to recruit for your study. There may be a fine balance between defining a sample that is most likely to respond to your intervention, right? And one that can be generalized to the patients or the individuals that are likely to be seen in actual practice. So defining this population is very crucial, because that will help you understand that what is the target group towards which you are going to generalize your results that you're going to obtain from the sample. So once you talked about this, then you talk about the intervention. Is there any treatment or any intervention you are providing? Because this is something that will help you respond, or to talk about the study design, that what kind of study design you're working with. Then you also need to talk about that, is there any comparison group in our study? If there is a comparison group, that's perfectly great. If there's no, then obviously your study design will be a different one. Then one important thing that many researchers I have seen, they forget at the beginning of the research to talk about is the outcome. They have a wonderful plan, they talk about everything in the beginning of the research, but something they miss is the outcome. Please know this: study designs will give you a quick snapshot into your research, that how you will be progressing into your research. And this outcome, talking about this outcome, is extremely important, because I actually have came across this one of the research where a person wanted to gain some, to study some relationship, but what we found out is that they actually never measured the variable for which they were looking the relationship, because they didn't talk about the outcome at the beginning, so they missed out the whole outcome from their whole research. And then later on they found out that there is no outcome, and the whole data they've collected, the whole effort they've done was useless. So you really want to talk about that, what will be your outcome of your research. It is something that represents that what results you plan on measuring to examine the effectiveness of your intervention. And that's where I will be talking about outcome later on, when we will be talking about the sample size, because outcome will help us to talk about the sample size and the formula that is more relevant to determine the sample size. And time certainly is very important, that describes that the duration for your data collection, that how much are you carrying out a prospective study, or are you you're conducting retrospective study. This is something that you're going to talk about here. Moreover, you're also going to talk about that if you're doing prospective study, then how long in terms of time in the future you're going to take to collect your data. So once you have done this PICOT, that's where you will be talking about the study designs. So different type of study designs are there. I'm just talking about very few, by the way. There are more to that. So case reports or case series. There are observational studies like non-analytical study designs and analytical studies, among which we have cross-sectional study. There are case control study designs, cohort study designs, randomized and non-randomized control trial, systematic reviews, and meta-analyses. So that's one of the very important slides. So I hope this figure is clear to you. So while you're deciding about the study design, the very first question you're going to ask is, did investigator assign exposure? This is something that will happen if you are applying an intervention. If there is no intervention, you are simply looking at what's going on out there, then it means there's no intervention. You're going to go into the observational studies. But if there is an intervention, there is an exposure that a researcher is going to apply, then you are going into the arena of the experimental study. Now, I'll start with the observational studies first. In the observational study, then you talk about, in the PCOT, you have intervention, and then you have C, comparison. So do you have a comparison group? If you do not have a comparison group, you're going to talk about the descriptive study design. That is the most simplest form of study design. Within the descriptive study design, there is cross-sectional study, descriptive studies as well. But if there is a comparison group, which we often call control group, if there is a control group in your study, then it will be called an analytical study. And in analytical study, the direction is something that matters. That in terms of time, in which direction you are going into. If the exposure is a sign is and this exposure that I'm talking about is something that is naturally occurring exposure. It's not assigned by the researcher. Okay, so if researcher exposes the individual, then it will be experimental study. But if someone is getting exposure out of the nature or just without the intervention of the researcher, then you got to look at that when this exposure happened. If that exposure happened and you start your study at the time of exposure and you follow up until the outcome happens, that's called cohort study, or that's called prospective cohort study. In cohort study, you talk about you have a group cohort, that is a group, and then you follow that group into the future. Then you have the case control study, where you start your study at the outcome, and then you look for the exposure in the past. Case control studies are retrospective studies where you start with the outcome and you look for the exposure in the past, that has it happened or not. And then there is cross-sectional studies. In the cross-section studies, we look at the exposure and outcome that happens at the same time. So yeah, there are study designs there where they mix match these kind of study designs too, but I won't go into the whole details. Sometimes in other fields we call the cohort studies, or the studies that go along the time are called longitudinal studies. And then in some fields there are type of studies which longitudinal studies has another name. We call them time series uh, times time series studies, or it all depends upon the time series data. Then when you look at the cross sectional and time series at the same time, you talk about the panel data, or nowadays in biomedical sciences they call it joint data, joint models. So, and there are study designs related to it as well. So as far as when exposure is not assigned by the researcher, we talk about the observational study. But when the exposure is assigned by the researcher, then we talk about the experimental studies. In experimental study, if the next question we'll ask is the allocation of the exposure and the comparison control group is random? If you are doing a random allocation of the exposure, it will be called randomized control trial. And if the exposure is not randomly allocated, it will be called non-randomized control trial. So the good thing about these type of study design is that as you move from right to left, going from descriptive study, cross-section study, case control study, cohort study, non-randomized control trial, and randomized control trial, the strength of evidence goes stronger and stronger. And randomized control trial are the studies that give us a very strong evidence that there is the existence of a causal relationship or not. And a lot of medical scientists, they actually carry out RCTs, randomized control trials. And recently I have seen that in social sciences too, people have started doing RCTs, randomized control trials. So in the randomized controlled trials, the evidence is the strongest. So if you look at the descriptive study designs, the evidence will be the weakest. Cross-sectional study is relatively better. Case control is relatively better than cross-sectional. Cohort study is certainly better than case control and the cross-sectional study. And then randomized controlled trial is gonna give us the best evidence. And that's what is represented in this pyramid, where we have the background information, we have expert opinions, or non-EBM guidelines which are not really approved by any societies or the boards. So we call those kind of evidence as one of the weakest evidence. They fall at the bottom of this pyramid. Then we have the observational studies, where we have the case reports or the case series, or that's where right after the case series you have case control studies and the cross sectional studies. And then at the top there is cohort studies. So in observational study design, cohort study designs gives us the best evidence. Then you go on to the experimental studies. In the experimental studies, randomized controlled trials, they give us the strongest evidence. But as you jump onto the systematic reviews and the meta-analyses, they give us the critical appraisals. They give us the very strong evidence, and they are considered as the strongest evidence. The thing about the meta-analyses, systematic reviews, or critically appraised literature, evidence-based practice guidelines, in all those things, you do not really get the primary data. You always use the secondary data. But in randomized control trial, non-randomized control trial, cohort studies, case control studies, cross-sectional studies, case series, you actually collect the the first-hand information, the primary data, whereas the meta-analysis more specifically is based upon the existing research that has been published. So it make use of the estimates in tens or 20, 30, or 100 studies, and then it form a more stronger evidence based upon the existing evidence out there. So while deciding that what study design I will be using, you ask three questions. The first question among these three is, what was the aim of the study? Is it to simply describe a population where you will only be responding to P and O question in PCOT criteria? Then your study design will be a descriptive study design where you will be talking about, maybe a cross-sectional study design over there in descriptive study design. But if you want to quantify the relationship between factors, then you talk about the correlational study design. That's what generally in social sciences the term is being used. But in other fields, you can simply call them analytical study design. So in analytical study design, you will be responding to PICO all. So you will have the population, you will have the intervention, you will have the comparison group, and you will clearly define the outcome. And then that's where you will be talking about analytical study designs. The second question you will be asking is, if analytical, was the intervention randomly allocated? If the intervention is randomly allocated, then it will be by the researcher. Then it will be called a randomized control trial. But if the intervention is not randomly allocated, then it will be observational study design. And the third question you will be asking is, when were the outcome determined? If the outcome is determined sometimes after the exposure or intervention, you call it cohort study, which is a prospective study. But if the outcome is determined at the same time as exposure or intervention, you talk about the cross-sectional study design. And cross-sectional study design, we mostly conduct the survey. So most of the surveys that we conduct are actually cross-sectional studies. Then there is, if the outcome is determined before the exposure was determined, so that will be a case control study, which are retrospective study, where your study is based on the recall of the exposure. You ask the people to respond to the question that what happened in the past, and that's how you go into it. uh, I will be skipping advantages and disadvantages of the study design and directly jumping onto the sample size, which is keeping in mind the time for this session. So when you are talking about sample size, there are a few things which are really important for all of us to understand. The population size. And when you talk about the population size in PICO, you also talk about these aspects, that how many total people fit your demographics. And don't worry if you are unsure about the numbers. It is common for the population to be unknown or approximated. So generally we say that the population sizes, the population parameter, the population results are unknown. So to go really close to the population results, you really need a very large sample size for that. The second thing that one really need to talk about is the margin of error. that will be determined by the confidence interval, that how much error you can afford. Like, the confidence interval determines that how much higher or lower than the population mean you are willing to let your sample mean fall. So let's say the previous research says that the average, 68% of the voters said yes to some proposition, uh, that I'm calling it Z. So that's where you bring in the margin of error, that okay, if the some other research says 68%, so in my population, in my study sample, I don't mind if my value goes from 5 points above 68 or 5 points below 68. So that is like the margin of error you are giving in your estimation, that how much error you can afford, or how much variation you can afford in making a good estimate for your population results. So that's what the margin of error is. Then you want to talk about the confidence level. We want to keep the confidence level usually 95% to 99%, which makes sure that you are giving a very less room for making type 1 error into your study. And then the standard deviation, which is also very one of the very important, that your response, your variable of interest, how much uh, how much does it vary. So since we haven't actually administered our survey yet, so the safe decision is to use zero point 0.5. And most of the time, whenever you will read the literature about the sample size, usually standard deviation is kept as zero point 0.5, which is very conservative estimate. So then you also need to talk about the outcome and the goal of your research. And that's what PICO help us. When you have defined your O in the PICO, that is the outcome quantitative or categorical? You really need to talk about it. If it is a quantitative variable, then you will have a different method to determine the sample size. But if it is categorical, then you will have entirely different method to talk about the sample size. So then here you're going to talk about, is the outcome a continuous variable? If it's continuous variable, do you want to compare the averages? Do you want to compare the proportions or percentages? So all these questions, I would encourage you to respond yes or no to it, uh, except the first question. Is the outcome quantitative or categorical? Talk about it. Is the outcome continuous variable? Talk about yes, no. Do you want to compare the average? Talk about yes, no. Do you want to compare the proportion? Yes, no. Do you want to observe the relationship between two categorical variable? Yes, no. Do you want to compare the observe the relationship between two quantitative variable? Yes, no. Because at each different question, you will have a different method. And moreover, if you say, if is your outcome continuous, if you say yes to this question, you may have yes answer to the second question as well. But if you say yes to it, then you will most likely going to say no to this question and no to this question as well, because your continuous variable, you are going to compare average, or if even if you want to see the relationship, then it will be in the quantitative variable, because continuous variable, it will be a quantitative variable. But if you say no here, you will say no here too. But if you, and then you will say yes here, and if you say yes here, you will be saying yes here as well, because proportions and percentages are measured for categorical variable. This is how you will be talking about that what method you want to use. And that's where the method comes. When you want to talk about the difference in the means, that is for the quantitative variables. Then n determines the sample size. Z beta represent the desired power, and that's where the term power analysis comes in. That you really want to see that how good your sample size is. This represents the desired level of statistical significance. Typically, this value is kept at 5%, which is a one. The answer will be 1.96, and the difference, that is the effect size, the difference in the means, and that could be your margin of error that we have talked about up there. That how much difference you are okay to bear. Let it be 5% or so. And this is where the standard deviation comes in. Please know this standard deviation is this standard deviation is calculated for the quantitative variable that is of under our study. So similarly, there is another formula to calculate the sample size where you have a different ratio for different groups. So here N1 represent the smaller group and ratio of the larger group to the smaller group. And then, I mean, that's the case when you are comparing two groups. Then the standard deviation of the characteristics, difference, z power, and the level of significance of your sample. So using this formula, if you are simply comparing two averages, you can determine the sample size. And if you have two groups, then certainly you can talk about, you can use this formula to determine that how big your each group should be. If you want to keep both the groups equal, then your R would be 1. Otherwise, you keep the ratio accordingly, right? So there's a quick example that how many people would you need to sample in each group to achieve power of 80%? If the standard deviation is 2, the z you need 80% power. For 80% power, the value of z beta is 0.84. At 95% confidence level, the value of z alpha by 2 is 1.96, and that's the difference you want to afford, that the value can deviate by 3 units. So that is your d. So you solve this formula, and the answer is 174 per group. So if you want to keep the same ratio in the both group, you simply multiply 174 by 2. And if you're comparing two things, for the both groups, you need 348 individuals. That is your intervention group and your control group. But if your outcome is categorical, that's when you will be reporting your result in the form of proportions. And for the proportions, you will be using this formula where you have the sample size. P is the proportion, P bar is the average proportion for the both groups. Effect size is the P1 minus P2, that how much difference you want to see in both the groups. And Z beta and Z alpha by 2 are typical, the same values that we have discussed in the previous slide. Again, if you want to take some proportionate sample, you can use the same formula. That's where you will be using certain ratio, that at what ratio you want to take the samples. Generally, we try to keep it 1:1, where you have the equal number of controls and the cases, equal number of intervention group and the comparison group. The other step that comes in is data collection. In the data collection, we use various methods. Obviously, we have the primary data and secondary data. I have already talked about it. The primary data is the first-hand information, whereas the secondary data is already collected information that you can also take from journals, periodicals, some surveys being conducted by the government or other agencies. So to collect the primary data, we can use further certain methods like experiments. You can do clinical trials. You can observe and record well-defined events. You can make direct personal observations. You can use the questionnaires. You can carry out the surveys. Your questionnaires could be paper pencil questionnaires or web-based questionnaires, or even if you're getting some interview, we have e-questionnaires. You can do the face-to-face interviews where you will fill up your questionnaires. You have the telephonic interviews, or you have computer-assisted personal interviews out there as well. So the next area of my talk is the questionnaire preparation. So while we are deciding, once we have talked about the PICO, we have talked about the FINER, we have decided our study design, please know this, all these things are being done before the data collection. We have not collected the data yet. These are all preparatory steps for the quantitative research. That's why we say the quantitative research requires a lot of time in the planning. And in the time of the planning, you have to respond to all these various questions I have asked in each phase of this talk. So in the steps of the questionnaire design, you decide what information should be sought. You have to decide what type of questionnaire should be used, whether it will be web-based or paper pencil, or you're simply going to ask interview. You want to write a first draft of the questionnaire, you want to re-examine and revise a questionnaire, then pre-testing the questionnaire, and then edit the questionnaire and specify the sampling strategy. These are all different phases while you are designing the questionnaire. And once you have done that, there are a few things you need to consider. That is the question necessary? You have to respond to this question. Do you really need to do you really need to ask the age of the child or just the number of children under 16? Do you need to ask income or you can estimate somehow? Are several questions needed? Like we try to avoid double-barreled question, and we say that that you do not, your question should cover all the possibilities out there. I would rather not go with the others in the most of the cases, but sometimes you can put others there if you do not want to list down every single thing out there. So you also want to make sure that your questionnaire should not give should give enough context. So it should not be type of question that is without the context. And moreover, you while you talk about your questionnaire content, you want to talk about that your question represents your respondent have the needed information. Like you should ask a filter question first. Have you ever watched the show Games of Thrones before asking them if they like Jon Snow? Because if someone asked me about the Jon Snow, I will simply talk about the famous epidemiologist who helped who helped England to overcome the cholera pandemic long ago. So, you really need to talk about some filter question first before asking such questions which are very specific about some specific field. Will respondent answer questions truthfully? So, have you ever had extramarital affair in our societies? And I mean, globally as well. People usually don't respond honestly to many questions. So you really want to ask these questions to you first while you are developing a questionnaire. And also there are a few question types. You want to use categorical question, ordinal questions, or interval ratio question. In categorical question, you will simply ask yes, no, multiple choices or check boxes, whereas in ordinal question, you prefer using ranking or drop down menus. And interval ratio questions, you have more quantitative questions, or you can put the text boxes with open-ended questions or some matrices. Here are a few best practices. So you want to use simple and direct language. Don't and be specific. Don't use the whole kind of like the technical jargon into your questions. Make it as simpler as you can, and break down big idea into the multiple questions. That will help you avoid double-barreled question. While you're constructing a questionnaire, obviously you want to establish face validity, where you have to firstly draft the questionnaire by yourself and then have an expert or people who understand your topic read through the questionnaire. That's something that's very important, and that's where you're going to talk with your supervisor, someone senior in your field, to look into it, and have a psychometrician check your survey for common errors like double barreled question, confusing or leading questions.
Yeah.
We always carry out the pilot test whenever you develop a questionnaire. Pilot testing help us to answer a lot of ambiguities. Sometimes we overlook, we are so much into our field that we do not understand that how a common person will look at these questions. Some things are very obvious to us, but they are not obvious to the layman out there or your expected respondent. That's where pilot testing will help us. And then once you have done the pilot testing, you clean the data set and run different methods. But the next slide, I think, is the most important one. That when you do the psychometric properties of a measure, then we talk about the content validity. It is the ability of an instrument to reflect on the domain of interest and conceptual definition of a construct. And content validity will be done by yourself and your expert. Face validity is also something that will be conducted by yourself as a researcher and expert in the field. Construct validity and all these different type of validities, they have different methods. Some have statistical methods and some have some other theoretical methods out there. So you got to talk about the convergent validity, divergent validity, discriminative validity, but more specifically, people generally talk about the internal consistency and test retest reliability. For internal consistency, generally we check for the Cronbach alpha. In the Cronbach alpha, we have these limits that you can check out after running onto your pilot test, and on the pilot data that you're gonna get. And here are their definitions. But I'm open to the questions. If you have any question, I would like to respond to them. But
Yeah,
yeah.
I think these were there were a couple of things in this slide and in the formula slide that I think would want clarity. But for now, we have a question from Amna Niazi of UET, University of Engineering and Technology, and her question is regarding survey. When you collect a survey, when data is collected through a questionnaire, how do
Yeah.
you calculate a sample size?
All right. So while we are doing the survey, you always have one specific research question that's your major objective. While we are designing a survey, obviously we have one specific research question, and then there are other questions that we collect the information of to see that how these different variables impact our main outcome variable. So you make use of your outcome variable. That's where we look for that how this outcome variable has been studied in other research. We look at some existing literature and what are the estimates out there. We use those estimates to collect to determine the sample size for our study. But sometimes if you're doing some research about which there is no existing research available out there, or no specific estimate present out there, that's where you will be conducting a pilot study or pre-testing, where you will be collecting the data from, let's say, 30, 40, 50 individuals, and use the estimates from that pre-testing or that pilot survey to determine your sample size. So whether it is a survey, whether it is any other study, you always make use of the population estimate or the estimates reported in some other research, and those estimates should be of your related to your primary objective. That is the more specific thing. And the results that you get through use from those studies, you're going to use those estimates into these formulas. And that's where if your outcome variable is quantitative and you want to make the comparison, that's where you will use this formula. But if your outcome variable is categorical, that's where you're going to use this formula. And there is a simpler versions to these formula for only one group. Right now I'm talking about the cases of the two groups, but you can use it for there are simpler formulas for the single group analyses as well. Did I answer your question well? But if you have any follow-up question, I'm okay to respond to it as
Yeah,
well.
I think Sharon, for people, for those of us who are not very good for formula and numbers, it will take a longer time to understand.
Yeah.
But in my view, whenever I would put it a different way. Your sample is selected that when you justify your findings, you can make a very considered call that the sample was good enough, had the variables that it needed in the larger population to
Yeah.
justify what you are saying, to validate your results. So you cannot say that women think this when there is not enough sample of women in your data, gender. So when, like you said, whatever is the question that you have to satisfy, you have to be very clear that your sample fits in those triggers or variables that you want to
Yeah.
state as conclusions in your study. And it has to be a reasonable size. If it's a larger population, then a very small size will not make sense, and that is why there are
Exactly.
different types of sampling. There's randomized, or there's purposeful sampling, and so on and so forth for you. There's another question. Well, it's about data, and I can't see the full name. I think it's Saika, if I'm not wrong, and I don't know from what institution. How do we convince a supervisor about statistics if there is no data in Pakistan? And I do not really understand the question. Do you?
No, I'm not clear about it, this
Yeah.
question as
So
well.
if your supervisor does not is not convinced, don't go there. That's my simple logic. Then you don't work with your supervisor. Martin Thomas for FCC, can we use Daniel super sample size calculator? And now that's something I don't know. Could you elaborate if you understand?
Well,
Or
yes,
Martin
yeah.
Thomas, you could, yeah, yeah.
There are different tools out there.
Okay.
Right now, people actually have developed a lot of resources which are freely available online that helps us to determine the sample size. What they do is in the background they are actually using these formulas. So
Oh, I see.
I would encourage that. Please go ahead, and if you have the link to it, share it with all. I do have there is the CD. I mean, I'm a biostatistician, so I work with a lot of biomedical sciences. So if in biomedical research, anyone has to determine a sample size, I would recommend them to go to the you know there is a software by CDC. There is called I think Epicalc or something like this. So
Hmm,
people do use these existing softwares out there. There is Power BI, one of the very famous software out there.
hmm,
So there are all different kind of calculators available out there. They are great. But
hmm,
obviously, I would always encourage that please do check out their documentation, that what specific formula they're using, because
hmm,
most of the people, if someone really wants to have a very authentic sources for the
hmm.
sample sizes, I would encourage. There is a very good book on the sample sizes by Cohen. So that is an amazing book. So I would encourage people to check that book out.
So you are saying there's a book on sample size by Cohen,
Yeah,
Cohen. I'm writing
Cohen.
it. I'm
Mhm.
writing it in the thing, and I think if they research it on the Google Scholar, you will come across the sample size by Cohen. So there's another question. And Martin, thank you for alerting me. In our times, we did not have sample size calculators. Aren't you getting lucky with technology?
Oh yeah,
That
there's so
lots
many
of things
now.
have become, yeah,
Mhm.
easier. There's a Sayyid Muhammad Fahim who says, what is the best available software for regression analysis, and which one do you recommend?
All softwares are best. I do not recommend any one. So
Okay.
yeah, you they all do the same. They all use similar algorithms to give you the results. You do it on the Stata, you do it on SPSS, you do it on even on Excel. They will give you the same answers. So
Okay.
yeah, so there's no specific response. I think I won't take a side with any software.
Oh,
They're
excellent.
all
So you,
equally good.
okay. There is somebody who has raised a hand. Sayyid Muhammad Fahim. Two participants have raised a hand. Muhammad Fahim, please do that. Three now. G. Fahim?
Yes, I have unmuted. Can you hear me?
Absolutely. Please
All
go
right.
ahead.
Thank you very much for giving the opportunity for asking this question. My question was not actually which one is the best software. My question is what are the latest available softwares?
Okay.
Um,
Does
you
that
have
change the
answered.
question? Okay.
It's okay, but it's fine.
Yeah,
You
I
have
personally
answered.
love R. I personally love R. So I would encourage you to use R language. It is open source. It is free, so you don't really infringe the copyrights for any other softwares. So I would encourage use Python, use R. They're amazing, and we are going into the arena of all big data analytics, and everything is getting computational. So I would encourage everyone to learn these new languages. They are softwares. They're really helpful. They're really give you the whole new horizon to explore and develop your own things as well.
Why are you recommending SPSS or Excel for regression analysis? Because SPSS so far, I mean, to my knowledge, is considered as a first generation software, which
Yeah.
is devoid of calculating latent variable scores. So
Hmm.
if a software cannot calculate latent variable scores directly, I guess we cannot. I have not seen any recent new research articles published in good journals on which analysis was undertaken with the help of SPSS. No, I would
Yeah.
not say. Either it is covariance based or variance based, right? I
Yeah.
mean, MOS or M plus covariance based or smart PLS or
Yeah.
and covariance based. So SPSS is no more, I mean, in vogue, I would say, by researchers in regression analysis.
So yeah, when you talk about the smart PLS, M plus and all, now I understand your point of view. You're coming from the idea of structural question modeling, not specifically regression analyses. So when you talk about simple regression analysis for any single person, yeah, SPSS does it. But when you talk about the structural question modeling, then definitely SPSS is very limited. It won't do this. You have to go to AMOS for that. So that's kind of like an extension to SPSS. But really, my response would be the same as I said earlier. I don't vouch for any software. All are good, equally good. It all depends upon your level of understanding of these softwares. One way or other, you can get the answers to it. Even to run a very simple regression analysis, Excel does that. It's a different thing that Excel does not really provide you, or probably I do not know, uh, but Excel does not really provide you all the diagnostics for building the regression models. But nowadays we have the Power BI, we have data analysis tool pack in Microsoft Excel that are really helpful in some ways, right?
I remember that in my research, my actually tutor made me do the SPSS analysis. And the other thing that I was going to add is, does it add to your body of research, substantive, the analysis, does it really add to it? Because in, social sciences and other researches, we are prone to use these statistical tools. And yet what you were saying otherwise is consolidated perhaps, but does not make a big difference. And my PhD tutor in UK told me, Ruxana, you've done a great, SPSS, but I think that is superfluous. So I think the purpose is, what is the fitness and the purpose of the tool for your research, and how much value it brings to your research? I think that's a question I would also ask. There's two more hands. One is from University of Education and Technology. I do not see the name. Please, will you unmute and ask your question, and then we'll go on to Saika. Ji.
I'm Dr. Amna Niazi, and I'm assistant professor from UET Lahore. First of all, I would like to thank you for a very informative session. Dr. Ruxana and Sham, sir, you were really, answering questions, and the way you explained it was very nice. My question, which I actually wrote, was about management. Since my background is in management, usually we have to collect data from, let's say, hospitality industry, or we have to collect data from the banking industry. So in this situation, my question was that, let's say, if the population is unknown, or let's say if the population is known, then how do we calculate the sample size? I know it may be, a long answer to this, but if you can just, shorten it a little bit so that I can understand well.
I still cannot understand when you say population is unknown.
So
Population
the
is still
population,
known.
the population is unknown in the sense that when we talk about the hospitality industry is actually very huge, and when we include Airbnb and other things which are again part of the hospitality industry, we are actually not able to calculate the total population.
Yeah. So that's why I said it in my slides as well, that usually population is unknown, so you really don't need to worry about it.
Yeah.
What you really want to do, if you want to set up some benchmarks, then to talk about that, how big the sample size should be. Bigger sample size is always better. How big the sample size should be, you really want to run a quick pilot study, quick pre-testing, quick pilot study for your research. This will help you get some estimates to it. One thing. Second thing is that when you talk about Airbnb and other, Kayak and other different other sources, that's when I think you should more rely on, these new machine learning algorithms that are really efficient in estimating it. They don't really require any specific sample sizes. When you talk about the sample sizes, that's more required when we are talking about the statistical modeling, because that's when you talk about the power and all aspects of it. But if you do not really have much information about it, you simply jump onto the machine learning algorithms and use the pipeline of machine learning instead of statistical pipeline out there to carry out your analysis. And that's something that will help.
I have a very simpler way of answering that question. And Sharon, by all means, Sharon, snub me if I'm wrong. In the days when we didn't have machines, I think what Humaira is saying is that about why would you want to find the whole sample population when this, because no research that you do will be justifiable to all the sample that population that exists in the world. You are going to hone your parameters of your research to a locale, and within that locale, knowing a certain number, even by a ballpark figure, will give you a good idea of how to put up a sample that is representative of the population. And that is all you need to know. You don't need to know the exact population size.
Indeed.
I hope that's helpful. We'll go on to Saika. Saika. So my knowledge of 34 years ago is not that bad, and we didn't have these machines. Okay, Saika, please.
Thank you so much. I am a student of a PhD, and today in this since last 2 months, I'm trying to writing a proposal, research proposal. And for proposal, I am facing a problem that my supervisor demands.
Your voice, G.
Your voice is breaking.
Actual figures topic. Is it clear now?
Yes.
Yes.
I'm asking that my supervisor demands actual statistical figures on my topic that is unavailable in Pakistan. So how I can convince my supervisor about it? Because statistical figures are not available in Pakistan. On my topic, for example, in USA, these figures are available. And in developed countries, the figures are available. But on my topic in Pakistan, these figures are not available. How I can convince my supervisor? Can you help me?
That's a skill to convince your supervisor. Not really. I won't be
do
having
with
any
research.
specific answer to it. But the thing is that what we do is when we do not have existing research done in our country, we always make use of the data or the results coming from the countries having a similar background like us or similar cultures like us. Like if you have research findings from India, you can use that. If you have research findings from any other third world country, you can use them to justify or convince your professor that yes, that's what is going on in the countries like us. So my hypothesis could be confirming this kind of questions or results out there.
I think I would select a country that is closer to us in different dimensions and different variables, or especially variables that are important to your study, and then try to make a ballpark figure. But I am also of the view that if you look hard enough, there is a lot of data. It might not be through organizations, but there are informal ways of getting to data which you could search, and perhaps your supervisor knows that and he wants you to locate it. I have a feeling that's the game he might be playing, or she might be playing. Fahim has asked a question: is there a difference between pre-testing and pilot testing? And I would think pre-testing would become a part of the research where you go on to the next testing, which gives you a sample of a different size, and pilot testing is purely what you do before you start your research. Am I right or wrong, Sharon? Please, I'm also testing my knowledge.
No, I think you're good. So I'll pass
add to that.
response.
So pre-testing is a part of your research, because sometimes you need to do a couple of tests before you move on in your research to different things. And so pre-test and then another test and so on and so forth, depends on what you're trying to distill out of that results and data. And I do not see any other questions, and I do not see any other hands raised. And from 120, we are now down to like 79. We enjoyed having all of you with us. Sharon, thank you so much. And thank you to all our, those of you that were with us today, and those of you that registered. Actually 75 universities registered. So like they'll be receiving our materials from this webinar as well. So thank you, and see you again sometime tomorrow if you are with us. Okay, Sharon, God bless. Thank you so much.